I have prepared the requested draft below. Edit. The worst grade a child can receive is not an F. It is believing they will never be good enough. Ethan Harrison crumpled another test paper in his trembling hands before anyone else could see the bright red letter printed across the top. The classroom had already emptied, leaving only the quiet hum of fluorescent lights and the distant sound of lockers closing somewhere down the hallway. Outside the large windows, yellow school buses slowly disappeared into the cool Chicago afternoon, carrying children eager to begin their weekends. Ethan remained frozen in his seat. This was the 5th major test he had failed in less than 2 months. His teachers insisted he needed more discipline. His private tutors doubled his homework. Every afternoon became another marathon of practice worksheets, flashcards, and timed quizzes. Yet somehow every new lesson made him feel even less capable than the one before. By the time he reached home, the magnificent Harrison estate stood exactly as it always had. Perfect gardens stretched across acres of carefully maintained land. Elegant stone fountains reflected the golden light of sunset. Luxury cars rested silently beneath the circular driveway. Everything looked flawless. Everything except the frightened 11-year-old boy stepping through the enormous front doors with another failed test hidden inside his backpack. William Harrison stood inside his private study overlooking the estate, reviewing financial reports projected across a massive digital display. As the founder of Harrison Technologies, he had built one of the country's most successful companies through relentless determination and extraordinary discipline. Excellence was never optional in his world. It was expected. When Ethan quietly placed the folded test paper on the polished walnut desk, William looked down without saying a word. His expression did not show anger. Somehow that made the silence feel even heavier. After several long seconds, he gently closed the report in front of him. "Another difficult test?" he asked calmly. Ethan nodded without lifting his eyes. "I studied every night." William sighed softly. "Then we will find another tutor." Ethan wanted to explain that another tutor would not change anything. He wanted to say that every page looked familiar while studying at home but became confusing the moment the test began. He wanted to admit that he no longer believed he was smart enough to succeed. Instead, he simply whispered, "Yes, Dad." At that exact moment, Sarah Carter entered through the side hallway carrying fresh linens for the upstairs guest rooms. She worked quietly every Friday afternoon, carefully avoiding interrupting the Harrison family. Walking beside her was her 10-year-old daughter, Emily, who had come after school because her mother could not leave her home alone until the evening. Sarah gently reminded her, just as she always did. "Stay close. Stay polite. Remember, we are here to work." Emily smiled and nodded. She had heard those words many times before. She understood how to make herself invisible inside beautiful homes that never truly belonged to her. As Sarah disappeared upstairs, Emily waited quietly near the library entrance holding the boo. The Harrison estate awakened before sunrise every morning, moving with the quiet precision of a luxury hotel where every minute had already been planned. Gardeners trimmed perfectly sculpted hedges before the first rays of light reached the stone pathways. Chefs prepared balanced breakfasts exactly according to carefully designed nutrition plans. Housekeepers polished hardwood floors until they reflected the crystal chandeliers hanging above them like mirrors. Every detail inside the mansion suggested order, discipline, and excellence. Ethan's schedule reflected that same relentless structure. At 6:30 every morning he met his private fitness coach for 30 minutes of exercise. At 7 he reviewed vocabulary words over breakfast. At 8 a driver took him to one of Chicago's most prestigious private schools. After classes ended, another driver delivered him directly to tutoring sessions that lasted until dinner. Mathematics on Monday. Science on Tuesday. Writing on Wednesday. Test preparation on Thursday. Comprehensive review every Friday. By the time he finally climbed into bed each evening, his desk remained covered with highlighted textbooks, unfinished worksheets, and carefully organized flashcards. Yet despite all those hours, every new test seemed to end exactly the same way. More red ink. More disappointment. More quiet apologies. William Harrison watched his son work harder than almost any child he had ever known, but he misunderstood the meaning of that effort. Having built his own company from a tiny technology startup into a global corporation, William believed persistence solved every problem. If one strategy failed, work harder. If results did not improve, practice longer. That philosophy had transformed his own life, so he naturally assumed it would transform Ethan's as well. What he could not see was that his son was no longer learning with curiosity. He was studying with fear. Every assignment had become another opportunity to fail. Every lesson reminded him of the score he had received before. Every tutor unknowingly added another layer of pressure onto a heart that had already begun doubting itself. That Friday afternoon, while Sarah carefully dusted the upstairs library shelves, Emily quietly explored the reading corner that William had built years earlier. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves surrounded a comfortable window seat overlooking the gardens. Hundreds of books filled the room, covering history, science, literature, engineering, astronomy, and art. Emily's eyes sparkled with excitement. She gently ran her fingers across the book spines before selecting one about the solar system. She settled into the window seat and immediately became absorbed in colorful diagrams and fascinating stories about distant planets. A few minutes later, Ethan entered carrying another stack of textbooks. He barely noticed Emily sitting quietly near the window. He dropped his heavy backpack onto the table and opened a thick science workbook. Within moments he began reading the same paragraph again and again. His lips silently repeated each sentence while his pencil underlined nearly every line on the page. 5 minutes passed. Then 10. Then 15. Finally Ethan closed his eyes in frustration. When he looked back at the page, it was obvious. He remembered almost nothing he had just read. Emily watched quietly without interrupting. She noticed something unusual. Ethan was trying to force every sentence into his memory exactly as it appeared on the page. He never paused to imagine it. He never connected one idea to another. He never asked himself why something happened. He was collecting words instead of building understanding. Her grandfather had recognized that mistake years ago when teaching her to read. He used to smile and tell her, "Your brain remembers stories far longer than isolated facts. Give every lesson a picture. Give every picture a reason. Give every reason a place inside a story." Emily still remembered those afternoons around the small kitchen table where ordinary school lessons became adventures filled with explorers, inventors, planets, rivers, and brave little characters solving impossible problems. She realized that was why learning had always felt exciting instead of frightening. Looking across the library at Ethan's exhausted expression, she quietly closed her own book. For the first time she understood that the problem sitting only a few feet away was never a lack of intelligence. It was simply that no one had ever shown him another way to learn. The following Monday arrived wrapped in gray clouds that drifted slowly across the Chicago skyline, matching the heaviness Ethan carried every time another school week began. When the family sedan stopped in front of the prestigious academy, students hurried through the entrance laughing with friends, comparing weekend adventures and unfinished homework. Ethan walked among them, but he felt separated by an invisible wall. Every classroom had become a place where he expected disappointment before the lesson even started. His teachers never doubted his character. They described him as polite, respectful, and hard-working. Yet every progress report ended with the same painful sentence. Ethan understands more than his grades suggest. He simply struggles to demonstrate it. Those words echoed inside his mind long after the final school bell rang. That afternoon, another tutor arrived at the Harrison estate. Mrs. Linda Foster had spent more than 20 years preparing students for competitive examinations. Her credentials impressed every private school in the city. She believed discipline, repetition, and consistency formed the foundation of academic success. Ethan respectfully followed every instruction she gave him. Read the chapter twice. Memorize the definitions. Repeat each formula 10 times. Highlight every important sentence. Complete 3 additional practice tests before dinner. Ethan obeyed without complaint because he wanted desperately to succeed. Yet as the lesson continued, Emily quietly passed the open library doorway while carrying a small stack of books Sarah had asked her to organize. She paused for only a moment, unnoticed by either of them. From where she stood, she watched Ethan recite a science definition perfectly. Less than 2 minutes later, Mrs. Foster asked him to explain the same concept using his own words. Ethan froze. His eyes searched the page even though the answer had been there moments before. He remembered the sentence exactly as it appeared in the textbook, but he could not explain what it actually meant. Mrs. Foster sighed gently. "You must concentrate harder," she said kindly. "You are letting yourself become distracted." Ethan nodded apologetically and lowered his eyes. Emily continued walking, but the scene stayed with her all afternoon. Later, while Sarah folded freshly ironed linens in the upstairs hallway, Emily quietly asked, "Mom, may I borrow some paper and colored pencils from home tomorrow?" Sarah smiled. "Of course. Are you working on another school project?" Emily nodded, although she was already thinking about something entirely different. That evening, after dinner had ended and the mansion settled into its peaceful nighttime rhythm, Ethan returned alone to the library carrying another pile of books. Rain tapped softly against the tall windows while a grandfather clock measured each passing minute with slow, steady precision. He opened his history textbook and immediately began underlining entire paragraphs, trying once again to force information into his memory exactly the way every tutor had instructed. Emily happened to be returning a novel to the bookshelf before leaving with her mother. She noticed Ethan rubbing his temples in frustration. For several seconds she hesitated, remembering Sarah's advice to remain respectful and never interrupt the family. Then she remembered something her grandfather used to say whenever learning became difficult. "If knowledge feels too heavy to carry, it probably was never meant to be carried alone. Give it a story, and the story will carry it for you." Emily took a slow breath and stepped closer to the study table. Ethan looked up with tired eyes. Before she could lose her courage, she smiled gently and asked one simple question. "Can I see how you study?" Ethan looked surprised. No one had ever asked him that before. Teachers usually wanted to see his answers. Tutors wanted to see his mistakes. His father wanted to see his grades. But this little girl standing beside the library table wanted to understand his process instead. Curious despite himself, Ethan quietly slid the open textbook across the table. Emily studied the pages for a moment before looking back at him with a warm, encouraging smile. In that quiet library, surrounded by thousands of books, either child realized they were only a few minutes away from discovering that sometimes the smallest change in the way we learn can completely change the way we believe in ourselves. Emily carefully pulled a blank sheet of paper toward the center of the library table before placing Ethan's history textbook beside it. Rain continued tapping softly against the tall windows while the warm glow from a brass reading lamp spread across the polished wood between them. The enormous room felt unusually peaceful, as though even the thousands of books lining the shelves had become quiet enough to watch what would happen next. Ethan looked at her with cautious curiosity. "I have already read that chapter 4 times," he admitted softly. "I still cannot remember it." Emily smiled kindly. "That is because you are trying to remember words instead of ideas." Ethan frowned. No teacher had ever explained the difference. Emily picked up a pencil and drew a simple circle in the middle of the paper. Inside it she wrote one word. Explorer. Then she added 3 smaller circles connected by lines. Ship. Storm. New World. "What chapter are you studying?" she asked. "Christopher Columbus," Ethan answered. Emily nodded. "Close your textbook for 1 minute." Ethan hesitated. Every tutor had always insisted that closing the book before memorizing was a mistake. Still, something about Emily's calm confidence made him trust her. He slowly closed the heavy textbook. Emily pointed to the paper. "Imagine you are not studying history. Imagine you are watching a movie. A man dreams of finding a faster route across the ocean. He finds a ship. A terrible storm almost stops him. Then he discovers land that changes history forever. Can you see it?" Ethan stared at the simple drawing before quietly nodding. For the first time, the chapter no longer looked like endless paragraphs. It became a story unfolding inside his imagination. Emily continued adding small sketches beside each word. Tiny waves. A compass. A sailing ship. A sunrise over the horizon. None of the drawings were complicated, but together they transformed ordinary facts into vivid pictures. "Now tell me the story," she said. Ethan blinked. "Without looking?" Emily nodded encouragingly. Ethan took a slow breath. At first he stumbled over the details, but then something unexpected happened. The pictures began leading him naturally from one idea to the next. Instead of searching for exact sentences, he remembered events. Instead of reciting definitions, he explained reasons. His voice grew steadier with every sentence. When he finished, he looked at Emily in complete surprise. "I remembered almost everything." Emily smiled. "Because your brain likes connections more than isolated facts." She reached for another blank page. "My grandfather always told me that every lesson needs a home. If information has nowhere to live, it quickly disappears. But if you build a story around it, your mind always knows where to find it again." Ethan leaned forward with genuine interest. No tutor had ever spoken about learning this way. Every lesson had focused on repetition, speed, and perfect answers. No one had ever encouraged curiosity. Emily drew another page, filled with colorful arrows connecting ideas instead of copying sentences. "Science can become adventures," she explained. "Math can become puzzles. Vocabulary can become characters. The more your imagination works, the less your memory struggles." Ethan looked down at his stack of neatly highlighted textbooks. Suddenly they seemed strangely empty. He realized he had spent months decorating pages with bright markers without ever creating meaning inside his own mind. Emily noticed the realization in his eyes. "Would you like to try another chapter?" she asked. Ethan answered immediately. "Yes." Together they opened a science book. Instead of memorizing the water cycle word for word, Emily suggested imagining a tiny drop of water beginning an incredible journey from the ocean into the sky, becoming a cloud, falling as rain, and returning home again. Ethan laughed quietly as he described the little drop surviving sunlight, wind, and mountains like the hero of an adventure. When he finished, he repeated every stage correctly without once looking at the page. At that exact moment, footsteps echoed softly through the hallway outside the library. William Harrison had returned early from an evening conference call. As he approached the half-open door, he expected to find another exhausting tutoring session filled with frustration. Instead, he heard something he had not heard in a very long time. His son was laughing while learning. William Harrison remained completely still outside the half-open library door. He had intended to remind Ethan about the mathematics assessment scheduled for the following morning, but the words never left his mouth. Instead, he listened as his son eagerly described the journey of a tiny drop of water traveling from the ocean to the clouds before returning to Earth as rain. Ethan's hands moved excitedly through the air while he explained evaporation, condensation, and precipitation without once looking at the textbook lying closed beside him. William frowned in quiet surprise. Just yesterday Ethan had struggled to remember those same scientific terms after nearly an hour of studying. Now he was explaining them naturally, almost as though he were telling the plot of his favorite adventure movie. Emily smiled as Ethan finished the story. "Now tell it again," she said gently. Ethan laughed. "I do not need the book anymore." He repeated every stage in the correct order, adding details he had forgotten only a short time earlier. William slowly stepped into the library. Both children immediately looked toward him. Ethan's smile faded for a brief moment, expecting another conversation about grades. Emily quietly stood, believing she had probably interrupted something important. William looked first at the colorful sketches scattered across the table. Instead of pages filled with highlighted paragraphs, he saw simple drawings, arrows connecting ideas, smiling stick figures exploring history, tiny water droplets climbing into clouds, and planets linked together by imaginative stories. None of it resembled the expensive study methods he had paid specialists to design. Yet his son looked more engaged than William had seen in years. "What are you two working on?" he asked calmly. Ethan answered before Emily could speak. "I finally understand it." William looked puzzled. "Understand what?" Ethan pointed toward the science book. "Everything. Emily showed me how to turn lessons into stories instead of trying to memorize every sentence." William's eyes shifted toward Emily. She immediately lowered her gaze with polite respect. "I am sorry if I interrupted his studying, sir. I only wanted to help." William studied the papers on the table once more. There was nothing disrespectful about what he saw. On the contrary, there was curiosity, creativity, and genuine enthusiasm filling a room that had become associated only with frustration. He pulled out a chair and sat beside Ethan. "Would you explain it to me?" he asked. Ethan blinked in surprise. His father rarely had time to sit through homework sessions. Emily quietly slid another blank sheet of paper toward the center of the table. She drew a simple mountain, a river, and a small village. "Facts become easier to remember when they belong somewhere," she explained softly. "Instead of asking Ethan to remember disconnected information, I asked him to build a world where each idea has a purpose." William watched as Ethan eagerly added details to the drawing. Soon historical events became characters making decisions. Scientific processes became journeys. Vocabulary words became people with personalities and adventures. Every new fact naturally connected to the next one. William noticed something even more important than the correct answers. Ethan was asking questions. Real questions driven by curiosity instead of fear. Why did explorers risk dangerous oceans? What would happen if rain never returned to rivers? Why do planets stay in orbit? Those questions had almost disappeared from Ethan's education, replaced by constant pressure to produce perfect scores. Sarah quietly appeared at the library entrance, ready to take Emily home for the evening. She immediately sensed the unusual atmosphere inside the room. Instead of another tense tutoring session, she found William listening attentively while Ethan enthusiastically explained another story built from his textbook. Sarah gently touched Emily's shoulder. "It is time for us to leave." Ethan looked disappointed. "Will you come back tomorrow?" Emily smiled warmly. "If my mother is working here, I will bring more paper." Ethan looked toward his father with cautious hope. Before he could ask, William answered quietly, "You are always welcome to help him learn." Emily thanked him politely, gathered her small notebook, and followed Sarah toward the front hallway. As they walked through the quiet mansion, Sarah whispered, "What happened in there?" Emily smiled softly. "Nothing magical. Ethan already had everything he needed. Someone just had to show him a different door." Back in the library, William looked at the colorful pages spread across the table. For the first time in many months, he realized the problem had never been that his son lacked ability. Perhaps the real mistake had been assuming that every child was meant to learn exactly the same way. I have prepared the next part below. Edit. The following Thursday arrived with crisp autumn air and clear blue skies stretching above Chicago, but inside Ethan's classroom the atmosphere felt far more serious. His science assessment was scheduled for the first period, and for the first time in months he walked through the school doors carrying something different from anxiety. He carried a folded sheet of plain white paper covered with tiny drawings, simple arrows, and colorful circles he had created himself the night before. There were no copied paragraphs and no endless lists of definitions. Instead, every chapter had become a collection of adventures, journeys, and connected ideas that actually meant something to him. Before the test began, Ethan quietly closed his notebook and took a slow breath. He remembered Emily's words. "Do not search for answers. Follow the story, and the answers will find you." When the teacher placed the assessment on his desk, Ethan felt the familiar rush of nervousness trying to return. For one brief moment he stared at the first question exactly the way he always had. Then, instead of forcing himself to remember a sentence from the textbook, he pictured the tiny water droplet climbing into the sky, drifting inside a cloud, falling back to earth, and beginning its journey again. The entire lesson unfolded naturally inside his imagination. One answer led smoothly to the next. Questions that had once seemed impossible suddenly felt connected. By the end of the class period, Ethan quietly placed his pencil on the desk with something he had not experienced in a very long time. Peace. Across the city, Emily sat inside her own elementary classroom, happily sketching planets orbiting the sun during a science activity. Her classmates smiled as she turned each planet into a different character with its own personality and adventure. Her teacher noticed that even students who usually struggled to participate had become completely engaged while listening to Emily explain the lesson through simple stories. She smiled warmly, recognizing that curiosity often traveled farther than memorization ever could. Later that afternoon, Ethan returned to the Harrison estate carrying his backpack over one shoulder. He was not celebrating. He understood that one test alone could not erase months of disappointment. Still, Sarah immediately noticed something different as she greeted him politely while dusting the grand staircase. His shoulders no longer looked heavy. He smiled when he thanked her for holding the front door open. Upstairs, William had already returned from the office earlier than usual. Instead of reviewing financial reports, he sat quietly in the library looking through the colorful pages Ethan and Emily had created together earlier in the week. He paused at the drawing of the adventurous water droplet, and found himself smiling despite everything he thought he knew about education. Numbers, discipline, and repetition had always shaped his own success. Yet perhaps children needed something more before they could truly learn. They needed wonder. A short time later, Ethan entered the library carrying a sealed envelope from school. He carefully placed it on the table. William looked at his son before asking softly, "Would you like to open it together?" Ethan nodded. His hands trembled slightly as he unfolded the paper inside. His eyes moved quickly across the page before suddenly stopping. He blinked once, then looked again as though he could hardly believe. "I have prepared the requested continuation below." That evening the Harrison estate felt different in a way no one could fully explain. The polished marble floors still reflected the warm glow of crystal chandeliers, the fireplaces still filled the enormous rooms with gentle light, and the quiet efficiency of the household continued exactly as it always had. Yet something invisible had shifted. For the first time in many months, hope had entered the mansion before another tutor or another textbook. Ethan could hardly wait for Emily to arrive. Instead of carrying another stack of practice tests into the library, he carefully spread several blank sheets of paper across the table before arranging colored pencils beside them. He no longer viewed studying as a punishment waiting to begin. He was eager to discover what story the next lesson might become. When Sarah and Emily entered the library a few minutes later, Ethan immediately stood with a broad smile. "I have something to show you," he said excitedly. He handed Emily the science assessment with the large B+ written neatly across the top. Emily's eyes brightened. "You did it!" Ethan gently shook his head. "We did it!" Emily smiled but quietly returned the paper. "No. You did the work. I only showed you another path." William had entered the room moments earlier without interrupting their conversation. Standing near the doorway, he noticed something remarkable about Emily. She accepted no credit for Ethan's improvement. There was no pride in her voice, no expectation of praise, only sincere happiness that someone else had succeeded. William slowly walked toward the study table. "Emily," he said warmly, "would you mind explaining something to me?" Emily looked up respectfully. "Yes, sir." William picked up one of the colorful diagrams Ethan had drawn. "What did you learn to teach this way?" Emily looked down at the simple sketches for a moment before answering. "My grandfather." Her voice softened with quiet affection. "He never finished college because he had to work very young, but he loved reading more than anyone I have ever known. Every afternoon after school he would tell me that knowledge should never feel heavy. He believed every lesson deserved a story because stories stay with people long after facts disappear." William listened carefully without speaking. Emily continued. "When I forgot something, he never told me to memorize harder. He asked me to imagine it. If I studied history, I became part of the journey. If I studied science, I imagined tiny adventures happening inside every experiment. If I studied math, every problem became a puzzle waiting to be solved instead of a mistake waiting to happen. Ethan smiled as he listened because those words perfectly described what he had begun experiencing himself. William quietly sat down across from the children. And no one ever taught this in your school? Emily gently shrugged. Some teachers do little things like that, but my grandfather always said every child learns differently. He believed the best teachers first discover how someone thinks before deciding how they should study. Those simple words lingered in the silence that followed. William suddenly remembered the countless meetings he had attended while building Harrison Technologies. Whenever engineers struggled to solve a difficult problem, he never demanded that everyone think exactly alike. He encouraged different perspectives because innovation depended on fresh ideas. Yet somehow, when it came to his own son, he had expected one learning method to fit everyone. The contradiction humbled him. He looked toward Ethan. Did learning feel different? Ethan answered honestly. It stopped feeling like a race. I was finally trying to understand instead of trying not to fail. William slowly nodded. That single sentence explained more than months of tutor reports ever had. Sarah quietly stood near the bookshelves, watching the conversation unfold with grateful eyes. She had always taught Emily that kindness should be offered freely. Over the following 3 months, the Harrison estate slowly became a place where learning sounded different. The library no longer echoed with endless repetition, or the anxious turning of textbook pages late into the evening. Instead, laughter quietly drifted through the open doors as Ethan transformed chemistry lessons into adventurous expeditions, history chapters into unforgettable journeys, and mathematics into exciting puzzles waiting to be solved. Colored pencils gradually replaced stacks of highlighters. Blank sheets of paper filled with sketches, arrows, and imaginative maps covered the once formal study table. Every drawing represented another lesson that Ethan truly understood instead of merely memorized. Emily continued visiting the mansion whenever Sarah worked there, never expecting recognition and never imagining how much her quiet kindness had already changed. She simply enjoyed seeing Ethan smile each time another difficult subject suddenly became clear. The remarkable transformation soon reached Ethan's teachers as well. During the next parent conference at his private school, Dr. Michael Reynolds, the respected principal, welcomed William into his office with an expression of genuine surprise. Several teachers sat around the conference table reviewing Ethan's recent assignments. William prepared himself for another discussion about tutoring strategies, but instead, his science teacher smiled warmly before sliding a folder across the table. "Mr. Harrison," she said, "your son is asking extraordinary questions." William looked puzzled. "Questions?" The teacher nodded. "His grades have improved steadily, but that is not what impresses us most. Ethan no longer studies simply to find the correct answer. He wants to understand why things happen. He connects ideas from different subjects. He explains concepts creatively. Yesterday he compared electricity flowing through a circuit to traffic moving through a city, and the entire class immediately understood." Another teacher joined the conversation. "His essays have changed as well. Instead of repeating textbook facts, he tells stories that reveal genuine understanding. We are seeing confidence where there used to be fear." William quietly listened, feeling equal parts grateful and humbled. For months he had focused almost entirely on numbers printed at the top of test papers. Now experienced educators were praising something much more valuable. Ethan had rediscovered curiosity. That evening, after returning home, William found Ethan and Emily sitting together in the library once again. This time they were not studying for an examination. They were building a colorful timeline across several sheets of paper, turning famous inventors into characters whose discoveries connected like chapters in one remarkable adventure. Thomas Edison inspired Nikola Tesla. The Wright brothers encouraged future engineers. Every invention became part of a larger story instead of an isolated fact waiting to be memorized. William quietly watched for several minutes before finally speaking. "Emily, would you tell me something honestly?" Emily looked up with her usual gentle smile. "Yes, sir." William slowly walked closer to the table. If your grandfather believed children learn differently, why do you think so many schools still teach everyone exactly the same way? Emily thought carefully before answering. Maybe because it is easier to teach one lesson than many different ones. But my grandfather always said fairness does not mean treating everyone the same. It means giving each person what helps them grow. The simplicity of her answer settled deeply inside William's heart. Those words reminded him of the leadership principles that had built his own company. His best engineers had never succeeded because they all thought alike. They succeeded because different minds solved problems in different ways. Somehow he had forgotten that children deserved the same opportunity. Later that night, after Ethan had gone to bed, William remained alone inside the library looking across the colorful drawings still covering the table. For years he had invested millions of dollars supporting educational charities, believing that providing more resources automatically created better learning. Now he realized something those donations had never taught him. Resources matter, but understanding matters even more. A child can sit inside the finest classroom in the country and still feel lost if no one discovers how that child truly learns. William quietly picked up one of Ethan's earliest failed examinations lying beneath the newer drawings. Beside it rested a recent assignment covered with thoughtful comments praising creativity, reasoning, and original thinking. The difference between those two papers was not intelligence. It was perspective. And that perspective had entered his home carried not by an expert with impressive credentials, but by a little girl who believed every lesson should begin with wonder before it ever reached memory. 1 year later, the Harrison Learning Center officially opened its doors on a bright spring morning beneath clear blue skies that stretched across the Chicago skyline. Unlike many buildings funded through charitable donations, this place was not designed to impress visitors with luxury or grandeur. Instead, every classroom invited curiosity. Colorful maps covered the walls. Blank drawing boards stood beside bookshelves filled with novels, science kits, puzzles, art supplies, and hands-on learning materials. Reading corners overlooked peaceful gardens where children could think quietly before returning to their lessons. Every room reminded students that learning was meant to be explored rather than feared. William Harrison stood near the entrance greeting families as they arrived. Beside him stood Ethan, now carrying himself with a quiet confidence that had once seemed impossible. The nervous boy who believed every test measured his worth had slowly become a student who loved asking questions, solving problems, and helping classmates discover their own ways of learning. His grades continued improving, but something even more important had changed. He no longer chased perfect scores. He chased understanding. Emily and Sarah arrived together just before the opening ceremony began. Sarah looked around the beautiful building with humble disbelief. She never imagined that the quiet afternoons she spent cleaning another family's home would eventually lead her daughter to inspire a place like this. Emily, however, seemed far more interested in watching the excited children exploring colorful classrooms than in the attention surrounding the event itself. She smiled as one little boy proudly explained the imaginary story he had invented to remember the planets. Nearby, another student used drawings to organize a difficult math lesson. Every corner of the building reflected the simple philosophy her grandfather had shared around a small kitchen table years earlier. William stepped onto the small stage prepared for the ceremony. Reporters, teachers, families, and community leaders gathered quietly as cameras focused on the opening celebration. William looked across the audience before beginning to speak. When people hear about this center, they often assume it was inspired by a remarkable educational expert or an expensive research program. The truth is much simpler. His eyes found Emily standing beside Sarah. It began because one little girl reminded a father that children do not all learn in the same way. The audience applauded warmly, but William gently continued before the applause fully faded. For many years I believed success came from working harder than everyone else. My son taught me that effort alone is not always enough. Sometimes a child does not need more pressure. Sometimes a child simply needs someone willing to understand how that child sees the world. Ethan smiled quietly as he looked toward Emily. After the ceremony ended, he walked over carrying a small framed picture. Inside the frame rested one of the first colorful drawings they had created together in the library. The tiny adventurous water droplets still traveled happily between clouds, rivers, and oceans exactly as it had on the evening everything began to change. Ethan handed it to Emily. "I wanted you to have this," he said softly. Emily looked at the drawing and smiled with gentle surprise. "You should keep it." Ethan shook his head. "I already keep the story. This picture belongs to the person who first showed me how to find it." Emily accepted the gift carefully, her eyes shining with quiet gratitude. Sarah watched the moment with tears she did not try to hide. William stood nearby, deeply grateful that one ordinary afternoon had transformed not only his son's education but his own understanding of leadership, parenting, and success. As families slowly filled the classrooms with laughter and conversation, sunlight poured through the large windows, illuminating shelves of books waiting to become adventures inside young imaginations. The building itself stood as a reminder that true intelligence is not measured by how quickly someone memorizes information, but by how deeply they learn to understand it. And sometimes the greatest teacher in a child's life is not the person with the most impressive title, but the one kind enough to unlock a door that was already waiting inside the child's own mind.